Hi, my name is Paul Vanderclay. I'm the pastor of Livingstone's Christian Reformed Church in Sacramento, California, and I want to do a little video on Jordan Peterson. I've been spending a lot of time watching Jordan Peterson's videos, and from the comment section in YouTube, I'm not alone. And so basically I had three questions I was pondering this morning about Jordan Peterson. Why do young atheists find him compelling? Why do conservative Christians find him compelling? And why do I find him compelling? As I was thinking about this morning, I was reflecting about in 2004, I visited an alligator farm with my family down in Florida. And I was watching these huge alligators sitting in what were basically concrete swimming pools, sometimes masses of them just sitting there, and I wondered, don't these alligators get bored? And so I asked one of the people that worked there, and he said, well, they have very small brains, and so basically if you keep them in semi-warm water and you throw chicken at them, they're pretty happy, and they breed and they multiply and they flourish in that. Now this always gets into the zoo question that we have. We go to a zoo and we see an animal and we think, oh, that animal is diminished. But if you read a book like The Life of Pi, you should wonder about that question, because is that animal diminished, or does that animal have free food and health care, and is that animal now safe from predators? And we might ask a human being, would you rather live in this concrete or wood enclosure that you have that is climate controlled with a refrigerator stocked with food, or would you rather live out in the Serengeti or be homeless here living on the street? And most of us would answer that. But at the same time, there's another piece of us that I think, especially for atheists, that they wrestle with, that, well, what does it mean? We certainly are not satisfied by just sitting at home and having enough food. We find ourselves drawn to programs like The Walking Dead or to extreme sports. Something in us is built for adventure, and it's built for story. And part of the materialist worldview suggests that we should be happy if we have everything we've ever asked for or everything we've ever needed, but we're not. So why is that? I'm going to talk a little bit about Dallas Willard a little bit later in this video, but years ago when I first read The Divine Conspiracy, actually about the second or third time I read the book, I was prompted to pick up Leo Tolstoy's Confession, and I noted that Peterson is a big Dostoevsky fan. He also talks about Tolstoy a bit. I also love Dostoevsky. But I picked up Tolstoy's Confession after I read this in The Divine Conspiracy, and was very much moved by the book. So I'll just read a quote here from The Divine Conspiracy, which refers to Tolstoy. Leo Tolstoy's A Confession is possibly the most important document of the last 2 centuries for understanding our current plight. The dogmas of modern unbelief had captured his elite circle of Russian intellectuals, artists, and members of the social upper crust, and the implications of it slowly destroyed the basis of his life. On those dogmas, only 2 things are real: particles and progress. Why do I live, he asked, and the answer he got was, in infinite space and infinite time, infinitely small particles change their forms in infinite complexity, and when you understood the laws of those mutations of form, you will understand why you live on Earth. You are an accidentally united little lump of something, the story continues. That little lump ferments. The little lump calls that fermenting its life. The lump will disintegrate, and there will be an end of this fermenting and all of the questions. But the lump dreams of progress. The faith in the majority of educated people of our day, Tolstoy observes, was expressed by the word progress. But then it appeared to me that this word meant something. I did not as yet understand that. Being tormented, like every vital man, by the question, how is it best for me to live? And you'll notice again that this is Peterson's question that drives him as he's working through all of the issues that he's working through. I did not as yet understand that, being tormented, like every vital man, by the question, how it is best for me to live. In my answer, live in conformity with progress. I was like a man in a boat who, when carried along by wind and waves, could reply to what for him is the chief and only question, whither to steer, by saying, we are being carried somewhere. And I think that that quote, even in the 80s when, I think it was the 80s or 90s when Willard wrote this book, is as vital today as it was then. And in fact, this has been the vital question since, for the last 200 years. And Peterson very much gets into this in his Maps of Meaning course. His Maps of Meaning, after I caught up with the biblical lectures, his Maps of Meaning was the first of his courses that I delved into and found it engaging and intriguing and fascinating. But it was the biblical lectures that first caught my attention, and I think that's probably what's intriguing the atheists. And so the atheists are asking themselves, why should I listen to this man ramble on about the Bible? There are hundreds of thousands of churches in the U.S. and Canada where you can go find someone rambling on about the Bible. And myself, as you can see what I work with, I work in the Bible all the time. Jordan Peterson is just learning about the Bible by his own admission. What I find helpful from him are his other observations that he brings in from his fields of knowledge. But he spends 2 hours rambling about the Bible. And why are atheists fascinated by this? I think that's a really important and compelling question. Another question I have is, why are conservative Christians? I'm a pastor in the Christian Reformed Church, which isn't really evangelical. It isn't really mainline. It's one of these weird immigrant churches that has been in the States the U.S. and Canada for a little over 150 years, mostly made up of Dutch immigrants, and it's having, all kinds of the normal problems of its own. Part of what's going on is that, Christians too are cross-pressured, as Charles Taylor said. Secularists, atheists, and skeptics in the West, I believe, are more Christian than they want to admit, and which I think Peterson is unveiling. But conservative Christians in the West are more secular and skeptical than they care to admit. All of the cross pressures impose on us, and people tend to stay in their tribes and keep with their groups until those pressures rise and amount to something where they have to break out. And we see this in what I call the great falling away that's happening in the churches right now. And so the questions that Peterson is engaging and the way he's engaging them are at a deep level. And I think Peterson is right that our motivations express something unconscious in us that we don't necessarily know or are in control of. And that's why, I noted at one of the lectures that someone stood up and said that a whole group of his seminary students from a conservative seminary were visiting his lectures and following him online. And I know others of my colleagues in the Christian Reformed Church, pastors, are following him online and wrestling with his questions. I think this gets into what in the West is a much larger question. The culture war we currently see, I think, is in some ways a Christian civil war. Christendom obviously captured the West for many years, and I think Peterson speaks eloquently about how Nietzsche saw this and has really opened my eyes to Nietzsche in a new way. But I think in many ways what we're experiencing and what we call this culture war in the West, of which kind of the mainline church and the evangelical or conservative churches are fighting proxy wars in this. We're really working out the attempt of the Enlightenment to transcend a lot of the conflicts that arose in the Protestant Reformation. The Protestant Reformation was not just a religious reform movement, it was very much a political movement, and it broke open Western Europe, and Western Europe was racked by wars and by bloodletting over doctrine, and Europe had to figure out, how can we live with each other with all of these differences in doctrine? And the Enlightenment answer in many ways was, well, let's establish truth in some other platform besides the interpretation of the Bible. And with all of the different rising of all the different movements at that time, kind of an answer coalesced around a rather empirical view of history. And this has dominated the Western conversations about church. And of course, when Charles Darwin and a lot of the newer science arose that made people skeptical about the Bible in terms of it as a source of the way we understood truth as empirical truth in history, this just kind of accentuated and inflamed the conflict. And so you had the modernists on one side that were saying, well, so it's poetic truth, but it can't be literal truth. And the fundamentalists doubling down on the other side saying, no, the Bible is right, and which leads to young earth creationists and that entire thing. I think this in many ways is a Christian civil war, which again leads me to say that many skeptics and secularists in the West are more Christian than they imagine. I think the roots even of a lot of the left-leaning elements of the culture war are prompted by Christianity in many ways. They have their roots in Christianity. And so this very much is a civil war. I told you I would circle back to Dallas Willard. Dallas Willard was a professor of philosophy at University of Southern California. He was also a vital Christian leader in the formation movement. Richard Foster was another leader in that movement. Dallas Willard died a few years ago, but you can still find plenty of his lectures on YouTube. And one of the things that he really wrestled with, as does Jordan Peterson, was the role of morality in the academy. But the 1980s and 1990s, when Willard was doing this work, it was a very different period. And so at the end of the Cold War, you know, that we didn't have the rise of the social justice warrior that we have today. But yet part of Willard's complaint was that Christian knowledge was not considered to be knowledge in the academy. And why not? And what did that have to do with moral understanding and moral teaching? And he opens his book, The Divine Conspiracy, with another very famous lecturer of psychology and practitioner, Robert Coles, who had written some pretty important stuff back in the 80s and observations within the Chronicle of Higher Education. And so I'll read some of this from The Divine Conspiracy. Robert Coles, professor of psychiatry and medical humanities at Harvard and a well-known researcher and commentator on matters social and moral, published a piece in the Chronicle of Higher Education, The Disparity Between the Intellect and the Character. The piece is about the task of connecting intellect to character. This task, he adds, is daunting. His essay was occasioned by an encounter with one of his students over the moral insensitivity. It is hard for him to say immoral behavior. Is it hard for him to say immoral behavior of other students? Some of the best and brightest at Harvard, this student was a young woman, a Midwestern working class background where, as is well known, things like right answers and ideology remain strong. She cleaned students' rooms to help pay her way through the university. Again and again, she reported to Coles, people who were in classes with her treated her ungraciously because of her lower economic position, without simple courtesy and respect, and often were rude and sometimes crude to her. She was repeatedly propositioned for sex by one young student in particular as she went about her work. He was a man with whom she had 2 moral reasoning courses in which he excelled and received the highest grades. This pattern of treatment led her to quit her job and leave the school and to something like an exit interview with Coles. After going over not only the behavior of her fellow students, but also the long list of highly educated people who have perpetuated the atrocities for which the 20th century is famous, she concluded by saying to him, "I've been taking all these philosophy courses, and we talk about what's true, what's important, what's good. Well, how do you teach people to be good?" And she added, "What's the point of knowing good if you don't keep trying to become a good person?" Now, this is very interesting in the light of everything that's going on in the university today, of which, of course, Jordan Peterson has kind of earned his fame for refusing to use pronouns. Now the question is obviously different because there's a huge moralism that has gripped the university. But as we've been seeing in the sexual harassment scandals, that it's not just, say, as you would imagine by the new ascendant morality that only conservatives sexually harass women, high-profile liberals sexually harass women. And so what we're seeing is that the new moralism that's supposed to allow moral behavior doesn't really succeed. And so this then kind of flops the question back on the other side. We spent the 80s and the 90s looking at the scandal in the Roman Catholic Church over pedophile priests, and now we're looking at harassing liberals like Harvey Weinstein. Now I should, because I know people who watch this are going to imagine, well, he's a Christian Reformed pastor. He's just a conservative. Any of you who know my story know that I've always been on kind of the liberal end of the Christian Reformed Church. And politically, I've always been a Democrat. I was raised in an African American community. The church that my father planted was predominantly an African American church, and so I've lived with this. I pastor a diverse, multi-ethnic congregation in Sacramento that does a lot of work with a lot of different kinds of people, and spend a lot of time with people struggling with mental illness, with the homeless. This is part of my ministry here, and so I'm watching these moral conversations and all of this happening with a relative degree of disgust and amazement, mostly at just how naive we are about our capacity for immorality and our capacity for duplicity. Religious people have known for a long time that our hearts are deceitful. In fact, this becomes a hallmark of our doctrine, especially in the Reformed camp. I'm a Christian Reformed minister, so I subscribe to the Reformed Confessions, and so it's not a surprise to us that our hearts are corrupt, and this is what we do, which I guess leads me to forgot the end of the quote. Professor Coles proceeds to comment on how ineffectual his efforts to respond to this young woman were. He seems genuinely conscience-stricken that he shrugged in response to her disappointment, but he never confronts the fact that he certainly did not tell the students in his courses that they should not treat someone doing menial work with disdain, or that they should not proposition a classmate or anyone else who's cleaning their rooms. And again, in light of the sexual harassment scandal, even if you tell someone, don't proposition someone for sex, this is not how human beings work. Again and again, as a pastor, people say to me, Pastor, why don't you tell them to do this? And I keep thinking, have you never met a human being? Do you not know that simply telling someone not to do something doesn't help them not do it? In one of the videos I've seen online about the hubbub at Yale University, one of the people who was most outspoken against the Halloween costume was on video, an African American wearing an Aladdin costume. And yet, and the next day he's going out and decrying cultural appropriation. And people are like, well, he's a hypocrite. And it's like, well, you know what? To be a human being is pretty much to be a hypocrite. That's what we're like. And so what shocks me is not so much the immorality of people, it's how naive the new ascendant morality is about human nature. So why do I find Jordan Peterson so compelling? I know some of my CRC colleagues and friends are a little horrified that I find Jordan Peterson so compelling. And I think the answer would be that I am cross-pressured. I live in a skeptical age. I have to deal with all of the different questions that combat us. And so actually part of how I do this is I've been reading C.S. Lewis's book Miracles 2-3 times a year. I found that Lewis is a terrific reading companion for Jordan Peterson, partly because Lewis was a medievalist, and Lewis also was a classicist, and Lewis read pretty much everything from antiquity in its original languages and could remember it all. And he was the one that I think in many ways really kind of set me up for Peterson and understanding mythology as good dreams. And anyone that wants to, that is really being compelled by Jordan Peterson and wants to continue this in other places of reading, I couldn't recommend C.S. Lewis's book on miracles more highly. And so I've just found for me that Lewis's book Miracles just really helps me with the cross pressures. I'm also a nerd. I've always been a nerd. I read Tolkien in junior high and fell in love with it and played Dungeons and Dragons and of course saw Star Wars and Star Trek and all of these things. A couple of years ago, College Humor did a YouTube that said basically religious people are nerds, and it was exactly right. Religious people are in many ways living out their fantasies. We're living out our stories by going to church and worshiping, by studying the Bible and living within it. In many ways, this is the oldest fandom that ever was. You see people dressing up to go to a Star Wars movie or dressing up to go to a Harry Potter party. Well, Christians dress up every Sunday to inhabit the world of the Bible. This is, as has been cliched, this is the greatest story ever told. And there's my phone. This is the greatest story ever told. And so Christians have the joy of living within it, within this cross-pressured world. And so in many ways, to be a Christian is to be a nerd. And as C.S. Lewis mentioned in his book, Reflections on the Psalms, praise is inner health made audible. I'm not going to stop the video because the phone was ringing. There, it stopped. Praise is inner health made audible. And when, as a Christian, you experience the joy of the Christian life, what we do in church, and it's not just monofocal in terms of we feel good when we praise God. We certainly do that, but it's the whole range of emotions. We get in touch with our hypocrisy when we confess our sins. We give concrete expression to our belief in God when we sacrifice. Jordan Peterson has spent a lot of time talking about sacrifice and Christian sacrifice in many ways. And Jesus tells us to do crazy things like love our enemies and pour ourselves out for people who are unworthy and ungrateful for what we have to do. And this is part of the joy of the Christian life. And I think another thing that Peterson has really helped articulate well is that, what this helps us do is actually not get rid of suffering. And C.S. Lewis does a lot of good work in this too. But as a Christian, in a sense, through Christ, we make our suffering like his. And that gives us, hopefully, a tremendous capacity to suffer and a tremendous capacity to have suffering not embitter us or make us angry or make us violent, but in fact, to have our suffering turn to generosity. And this is, in fact, what the Christian life is about. So if you haven't done anything with Jordan Peterson and you just are in touch with me, I would say, and if you want to start looking at Jordan Peterson, if you go on the web, you're immediately going to be plastered by a lot of the political stuff Peterson does, and I won't comment on that now. But if politically you're more to the left and you just get reactive with some of Peterson's stuff, I would recommend that you start by dealing with his online courses, Maps of Meaning 2017. I went all the way through that. Also his Personality and Transformations. I thought both courses were excellent. I found both tremendously engaging, and I enjoyed them. His Bible series I obviously find helpful because I'm a Bible nerd. His capacity to interpret the Bible, well, he's taking it from a psychological point of view, and so his most helpful insights quite obviously come from his area of expertise. And not necessarily biblical, although some of his observations about the Bible coming at it from a new way, I also find compelling and interesting and thought-provoking. And then just one other series, mostly I tell people just stick to what Peterson himself releases. A lot of the other stuff are sound bites that are in some ways weaponized to fight other people's battles. But the Transliminal channel has some really terrific interviews with Peterson, and whoever it is that's interviewing Peterson on that channel, I think is doing a terrific job with that. So there's a little video. I've been blogging on this a little bit at my blog. My blog is leadingchurch.com, and I can put that in there. But I've been rather convicted that if I'm going to talk about Peterson, for whom the primary method of disseminating his work has been YouTube, I should probably do something on YouTube. So if you've watched this, thanks for watching. Leave a comment. I'm trying to get better at servicing my YouTube page. I also have my sermons and my Sunday school classes. And I should say that Jordan Peterson has really helped me read the Bible through some different filters and get in touch with the way the Bible shares communication with religious communities of its day. I was recently doing a study of Ezekiel 16. You can find that on the Living Stones Christian Reformed Church channel. I did a 3-part series on Ezekiel 16, and the more I read Ezekiel 16, the more I realized this is conversing with Gilgamesh. And then when I was reading, when I was in Ezekiel 17, I was recognizing that was a parable about trees, and then suddenly all of the stuff that Peterson had talked about with trees helped me see all the tree connections in the Bible. So yeah, I guess in the service of Jordan Peterson, who is a pretty rambling stream of consciousness talker, I am too. But yeah, that's my place to start with Jordan Peterson. And if you get interested in him or engaged with him, let me know. I'd love to hear what you think. And yeah, I'm always looking for good conversation partners. So thanks for watching. Leave me a comment or send me a note.